And now, a passage from Early Welsh Settlers of Pennsylvania by Wayland F. Dunaway. The Welsh constituted an early and important element of the population of provincial Pennsylvania and made a significant contribution to its progress. Playing a conspicuous part in the founding of the colony, they were one of the formative influences that started it on its career of political, economic, and social development. The emigration of a considerable number of sturdy Welshmen to Pennsylvania was due primarily to religious motives. The early Welsh immigrants were mostly Quakers and were persecuted in their homeland for their religious principles. By acts of Parliament, their public worship was forbidden on penalty of fines and imprisonment. In these trying circumstances, they welcomed the opportunity to secure relief from oppression by migrating to Pennsylvania, and were among the first to accept Penn's liberal offers to the oppressed everywhere to seek an asylum in his province. The fact that Penn himself was a Quaker and was of Welsh ancestry strengthened their resolve to emigrate to his colony, where there was every assurance of religious liberty as well as of economic opportunity. A further consideration influencing their determination to emigrate was the belief that by purchasing a large tract of land and settling thereon in a body, they could maintain a community of their own in the New World, and thereby perpetuate their distinctive language and institutions. Inasmuch as many of the Welsh Quakers belonged to the gentry and were men of means, the accomplishment of this object seemed feasible. Linked with the desire to escape from persecution was the longing to perpetuate under happier skies the language and customs of their beloved country, and a combination of favoring circumstances pointed to the attainment of both these objects. With these purposes in mind, a committee of prominent Welsh Quakers visited William Penn in London in 1681 to enter into negotiations with him for the purchase of a large tract of land in Pennsylvania. The leader in this movement was John Ap John, the apostle of Quakerism in Wales, who may be regarded as the founder of the Society of Friends in that country, as well as the father of the Welsh tract in Pennsylvania. Proceeding with the caution characteristic of his race, John Ap John secured the appointment of a committee representing the monthly meetings of 6 Welsh shires with a view to holding a personal interview with Penn before embarking upon an enterprise of such consequence. The outstanding members of this committee were John Ap John, Dr. Thomas Wynne, Richard Ap Thomas, Dr. Griffith Owen, Dr. Edward Jones, John Ap Thomas, Hugh Roberts, Thomas Ellis, Charles Lloyd, Richard Davies, John Bevan, and Lewis Ap David. Being assured of religious liberty in the new colony, their main purpose in interviewing Penn was to reach an agreement with him that the lands which they proposed to purchase should be adjacent, so as to form a distinct settlement composed exclusively of Welsh. This would give them the opportunity they desired of maintaining undisturbed their own language and institutions, or at least they so believed. Furthermore, they wished to have it definitely understood that their settlement should constitute a barony or county palatine with a right of self-government, an imperium in imperio, within which all causes, quarrels, crimes, and disputes might be tried and wholly determined by officers, magistrates, and juries of our own language. The agreement reached between Penn and the Welsh delegation was verbal and was never later committed to writing, which was unfortunate in view of the controversy subsequently arising as to its details. It appears, however, that the committee was well satisfied with the results of the interview and agreed to purchase and dispose of 40,000 acres of land to the Welsh Friends. Accordingly, its members returned to their respective communities and reported favorably to the monthly meetings upon the project. Subscriptions were promptly made, and the enterprise was launched with enthusiasm. Such was the origin of the famous Welsh barony or Welsh tract in Pennsylvania. Inasmuch as it required time to dispose of land to actual settlers, and meanwhile arrangements had to be made with Penn to clinch the bargain, as well as to assure the carrying out of the particular objects in view respecting a distinctive settlement, special methods were adopted to effect these ends. The leaders in the enterprise became heads of companies of adventurers and, as trustees, took out patents in their own names for 30,000 acres of land to be disposed of to the Welsh settlers. 10,000 additional acres were conditionally engaged in view of prospective needs, and this land was later disposed of by Penn in small lots to actual settlers. Thus, the whole amount of land engaged for the Welsh barony was 40,000 acres. The patentees for the 30,000 acres for which Penn granted deeds in this tract may be considered, says Browning, self-constituted heads of 7 companies for the division and sale of this land to the Welsh, whom Penn and they hoped would be actual settlers on it. The heads of these companies were John Ap Thomas and Dr. Edward Jones, Company Number 1, 5,000 acres. Charles Lloyd and Margaret Davies, Company Number 2, 5,000 acres. John Bevan, 2,000 acres. John Ap John and Dr. Thomas Wynne, 5,000 acres. Lewis Ap David, 3,000 acres. Richard Ap Thomas, 5,000 acres. And Richard Davies, 5,000 acres. It appears that the heads of some of these companies acted merely as trustees in purchasing blocks of land, whereas the heads of other companies bought on their own account with the expectation of selling so much of their holdings as they did not wish to retain. Penn, however, regarded all these heads of companies as trustees and recognized no difference in his dealings with them. It seems that Penn, whose first plan was to dispose of his land in tracts of 5,000 acres, had in mind the Dutch scheme of patroon concessions, with which he was doubtless familiar. The first sales were made principally on the basis of 5,000 acres, for which the price was £100 sterling and a quit rent of 1 shilling for every 100 acres. As first purchasers, the Welsh bought the land in blocks before it had been surveyed, and their barony was not laid out until 1684. Its boundaries were not definitely determined until 1687. The Welsh barony of 40,000 acres lay on the west side of the Schuylkill, north of Philadelphia. It was a fertile, attractive region of about 62 square miles, admirably adapted to the requirements of the Welsh farmers who occupied it. Its general lines included 11 and a half of the present townships in Montgomery, Chester, and Delaware counties, of Lower and Upper Merion, Haverford, Radnor, Tredyffrin, East Westland, West Whiteland, Willistown, East Goshen, West Goshen, Easttown, and a part of Westtown. Magnificently located, it constituted a compact, thrifty, and distinctive settlement by a particularly desirable group of Welsh colonists. Settlement of the Welsh barony began early and proceeded rapidly. Authorities are agreed that between 1682 and 1700, the Welsh were the most numerous body of immigrants arriving in Pennsylvania. Their initial settlements were made in the townships of Marion and Haverford in 1682, and as population thickened, they spread rapidly over Radnor and Goshen townships. Soon thereafter, the swelling tide of Welsh immigrants occupied Goshen, Tredyffrin, and Oakland, and eventually settled the remaining townships of the barony. When Penn advertised his land in the New World, the Welsh were the first to accept his offers and the first racial group to effect a mass settlement within the bounds of the province under the charter. They did not even wait for Penn to precede them, but started at once to occupy their barony. Some arrived in the colony before Penn, and others came on the same ship with him. While for 2 decades they constituted the most numerous and perhaps the most substantial group among the diversified racial elements that flocked to Pennsylvania as to a land of promise. The pioneer Welshman in Pennsylvania was Dr. Edward Jones, whose ship, the Lion, arrived at Upland, August 13, 1682. Dr. Jones, described as Trarurgeon, was the first settler in the present county of Montgomery and was the founder of Marion in the Welsh tract. Accompanying him were his wife and 2 small children and about 40 other immigrants. Prominent among these were William Ap Edward and family, Edward Ap Rees and family, and Robert Ap David and family. These gentlemen were the landholders of the party and, with their families, numbered 16, while the others were farmhands and servants. This first group of settlers in the Welsh barony was assigned by Thomas Home, Penn surveyor, a tract of land on the west side of the Schuylkill, which they proceeded to occupy. Dr. Jones, who was prominent among the first settlers, became a justice of the peace in the Welsh tract and was one of its first representatives in the assembly. His co-founders of Marion, Edward Ap Rees, William Ap Edward, and Robert Ap David, were also outstanding men among the early settlers of the province. The second party of Marion adventurers to settle on the Thomas and Jones tract is known as the Hugh Roberts party, and included as landholders Hugh Roberts, Edward Owen, William John, Cadwallader Morgan, Hugh John, Gaynor Roberts, and Catherine Thomas. This company, numbering about 50 persons, arrived at Philadelphia in November 1683. Hugh Roberts, who headed the party, was a Quaker minister of high repute, first in Wales and later in Pennsylvania, a man of education and character who wielded a great influence among the Friends. Altogether, there were 17 purchasers who bought land through Thomas and Jones as agents or trustees of Company Number 1, who had land laid out for them in Marion embracing 5,000 acres. These were the pioneer settlers of the Welsh barony, all of whom were Quakers and men of character and property. The patent for 5,000 acres of land held in the name of Charles Lloyd and Margaret Davies each of whom had a half interest as trustees, was disposed of to Thomas Lloyd and 7 other Welsh Quakers. Charles Lloyd did not himself come to Pennsylvania, but transferred his interest to his brother Thomas. The allotment of 2,500 acres to Margaret Davies under this grant was conveyed by deeds in April 1683 to Joseph Harris, Thomas Jones, Edward Thomas, Margaret Thomas, John Humphrey, John Rithurch, and Thomas Morris. Thomas Lloyd, a man of great distinction in the early history of the province, was educated at Oxford and belonged to the Welsh gentry. Arriving in Philadelphia in August 1683, he at once became a leader in provincial affairs, serving as land commissioner, president of the council, and deputy governor. He never resided on his land in the Welsh barony, but lived in Philadelphia. John Bevan's patent for 2,000 acres in the Welsh tract was disposed of in part to Charles Ab Bevan, Matthew Jones, David Jones, and several others. In this third company of adventurers, John Bevan, Ab Evan, who was a Quaker minister acting as a trustee for this small group of settlers, was a large landholder and seems to have belonged to the gentry of Wales. Arriving with Hugh Roberts' party on the Morning Star in November 1683, he became prominent in the Welsh barony and throughout the province, serving as Justice of the Peace in Haverford Township and as a member of the Colonial Assembly. Rhys Thomas, who came over in the same ship with John Bevan in 1683, bought 300 acres of land in Marion Township, settled down as a prosperous farmer, and became a Justice of the Peace and a member of the Assembly.